is going to Natasha's going to tell us about her book, The Paris Secret. It's her newest book. It just came out on September 15th. If after tonight's program you are dying to get a copy, we have copies in the library, and it is also being sold at the White Rabbit bookstore in California, Maryland. Natasha has been gracious enough to sign book plates. So at the White Rabbit, they have the books and the book plates, and you can just stop by and get your own copy. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand the floor over to Natasha. What we will ask everyone to do, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that we do have a chat button. If you have comments or questions that you would like to ask Natasha, we will save those for the end. She's going to talk to us about her book for a while, and then I will read the questions off at the end, and I will ask them in turn. So you are welcome to type in the chat, and with that, take it away, Natasha.
Thank you very much. It's very lovely to be here. Normally at 7 o'clock in the morning, I'm making breakfast for my kids and making school lunches. So this is a much nicer way to spend the morning, I have to say. I thought that what I would do today is just spend a few minutes just giving you a little bit of background information about me, because I know that some of you may not know too much about who I am. And then I'll dive into talking a little bit more about The Paris Secret. So The Paris Secret is my third book to be published in North America. But I do have another book up my sleeve that not very many people know about. And it's this one here. It's called Mr. Men Go on a Picnic. Back in the day when I was 8 years old, when I was writing this book, I didn't know enough about author names being on the front covers of books, so it's missing my signature. But as you can see here, it's a little story that I wrote back when I was about 8 years old, and I did all the illustrations for it, stapled it up and bound it up into my very first book. So this was how I spent my childhood. I wrote books, poems, stories, and when I wasn't writing books, poems, and stories, I was at my local library getting out armloads of books every week and making my way through them. So for me as a child, books were the best part of my world. They were this amazing place where I could escape into wonderful stories and different places around the world and experience life as a different person. So it's safe to say that my childhood dream was to be doing something like this when I was a grown-up, although albeit probably with slightly better spelled words, I must say. But when I finished high school, I had a look around at the different options for someone who excelled in things like English literature and history and French language classes at school, and who had this dream of writing books. And there just didn't seem to be a way to do that, because over here where I live in Perth, Western Australia, the universities didn't offer creative writing degrees. And so I struggled to find some avenue for me to pursue this kind of passion I had for books and words. So I asked my father for advice. My father is an accountant, I should say, and he suggested that I do a Bachelor of Commerce because that was a useful degree that could lead to anywhere. And so I did. This woman who wanted to be a writer ended up doing a Bachelor of Commerce, and I majored in marketing and public relations, though I didn't kind of follow my father's footsteps into accounting, because I could see that marketing and public relations had this kind of writing element to them. So then I worked in marketing for about 10 or 12 years, and I had jobs with amazing companies like L'Oreal Paris. I worked as the marketing manager for the Maybelline brand of cosmetics for quite a while. I owned more lipsticks than any woman in her 20s could ever wear in a lifetime. And it was a pretty fabulous job and lots of fun. But throughout that whole time, I still kept onto this kind of writing dream, and it was still in the back of my mind. And I would still occasionally get out pieces of paper and scribble stories and things like that. And then there came a time in my life where everything sort of changed. I come from Perth in Western Australia, but I was working on the other side of Australia, the eastern side of Australia, in a town called Melbourne. and that was where L'Oreal was based. And then my husband had to come back to Perth for his work. And as he'd followed me across the country for my job, it seemed only fair that I then follow him back across the country for his, which meant quitting my fabulous job at L'Oreal and suddenly being, unemployed because I had to quit my job. And the thing about Perth, where I live, is it's a beautiful place. Our beaches are amazing, but mostly companies don't have their head offices here in Perth. And so I knew I wasn't going to be able to find the same kind of job in Perth as I'd had with L'Oreal and the other companies I'd worked for. So I thought to myself, well, what about if I did something different? Rather than just rushing back to get another marketing job, I've still got this writing dream burning away in the back of my mind. And now, 10 or 12 years later, the universities had started to offer creative writing programs. So I decided to go back to university as a mature age student, as it was back then, and embark on a creative writing degree. And so I did that for a couple of reasons, I guess, to find out if I was any good at writing for a start, and also to find out whether I would really enjoy it if it was something I kind of turned into a job. And it turned out that I got reasonably good marks for my writing and I loved it. So I decided to write a book as part of my kind of master's thesis that I was studying at that time. And that turned into my very first published book, which came out many years ago, and really, I guess, kickstarted my writing career. And so I was lucky enough to be able to kind of take it from there. And I moved into writing historical fiction in around 2016, and that's what I have been doing since then, and that's my passion. I love history, and I think I'll be writing historical fiction for a very long time. So all of that brings me up to the present day, where The Paris Secret is my latest book that has just come out, and that's the book I'm going to talk specifically about now. So I'm not sure whether you've read the blurb for this book, and I will tell you a little bit more specifically about the book later. But one of the things I wanted to kind of talk about to introduce the book is there's a man called Christian Dior, who we all know is a very famous fashion designer or couturier. He made some beautiful gowns many years ago between 1947 and 1957. And he's an incredibly famous man. Most people, if asked to name a fashion designer, would probably name Christian Dior. However, there's another Dior sibling who, to me, is also a very important person who perhaps not as many people know about. I wonder how many people have actually heard of Catherine Dior, Christian Dior's sister. Some people may have heard of Catherine Dior because she's the inspiration behind the perfume Miss Dior. The perfume was named for Catherine and her love of flowers. But Catherine did much more than simply be the inspiration for a Dior perfume. This is a picture of Catherine Dior here, and I took this up at a little villa called Villa Les Rhumes in Granville, which is the ex-Dior family home in France. And so Catherine was actually a woman I knew nothing about until I read there's a book by Anne Seber called Les Parisiennes, and it's about how the women of Paris kind of made their way through the Second World War. And in that book, Anne Seber mentions Catherine a couple of times. She mentions that Catherine worked for the French resistance during the Second World War, that her work was so important to the Allied war effort that the Nazis hunted her down, they arrested Catherine, they jailed her in Paris for a time, and then they sent her on the very last train out of Paris to Ravensbrück concentration camp. So Catherine was deported to Ravensbrück, to Germany, about a week before the Allies liberated Paris. She was imprisoned in Ravensbrück concentration camp for about 9 months. She suffered terribly at the camp. It was a place of torture. She suffered from dysentery and pneumonia. And she emerged from the camp at the end of the war barely alive. She managed to escape on a death march from Ravensbrück to another camp. But her work that she had done for the French resistance during those wartime years was so courageous and so important that after the war, she was awarded the Légion d'honneur and the Croix de Guerre by the French and the King's Medal for Courage in the cause of freedom by the British. So she was this amazing woman who had risked her life for freedom, who was a highly decorated wartime hero, but nobody knew who she was. everybody would be able to name Christian Dior, but this amazing woman who almost lost her life has been forgotten by history. And so I guess for me, when I read those things about her in Anne Seber's book, I knew immediately that I wanted to write about Catherine Dior. I wanted to resurrect her, I suppose, and bring her back to people's notice. So I embarked on this quest to find out more about her so that I could incorporate her into a book and into a story. And so those travels took me across the other side of Australia to Melbourne to a exhibition about Dior at the National Gallery of Victoria there. And it had lots of beautiful Dior gowns there, had a big display of the Miss Dior perfume, but it didn't mention Catherine at all. Again, here was another example of Catherine Dior, this wartime hero, being kind of forgotten. So then I went over to Paris to the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, where there was another amazing exhibition of Dior gowns. This exhibition was called the Couturier du Rêve. And once again, there were lots of incredible Dior gowns there. And then in the middle of the exhibition of gowns, I found this. This is a photograph of a letter. I'm not sure whether you can see that there. I'll just hold that a little bit closer. It's a handwritten letter written by Christian Dior to his father in April 1945. And Christian had just found out that after months and months and months of begging everybody he could think of to find out about his sister and where she had been taken, that Catherine was finally making her way back from Germany to France. And he was writing to let his father know that he was going to meet with Catherine near the French border and bring her back to their home. And so for me, this was in my research quest, this was the first piece of real concrete evidence of Catherine's existence. It was, here she was, her name was mentioned in this letter written by Christian. He was writing about the fact that she had been released from Ravensbrück. And I guess it was, everyone else in the museum exhibition hall was staring at the beautiful gowns, and here I was standing in front of this letter with my mouth hanging open, amazed and relieved to find a piece of evidence that would help me to piece together this book that I was trying to write. But really, so that letter is dated April 1945, but I wanted to know also what had happened to Catherine before that, what had happened to her during the war. So I still had lots of questions. And so then I went north from Paris, north and west, to Normandy, where the Diors were born and where they grew up. And as I mentioned before, there's a villa there, which you can just see there's a little pink house behind all the trees there. It's called Villa Les Rhumes, and it's the ex-Dior family home. And it's now been turned into a museum dedicated to the Diors, primarily Christian, obviously, but also the other Dior siblings. And I was hoping to find out more about Catherine at the museum. And I did. I certainly saw lots of photos of Catherine as a child. There's a little picture of Catherine as a little girl that was hanging on the wall of her former bedroom in the house. So there was a few scant pieces of information about Catherine in the ex-Dior family home, but not a lot. And so there was this kind of cute, I had these photos of Catherine as a child. I had this letter written by Christian in April 1945, but there was still a whole lot of gaps in Catherine's life story. She was very reluctant to speak about her wartime experiences once she returned to France after the war, as many women were at that time. What they had experienced in the concentration camp was so terrible that they couldn't speak about it. And certainly at that time in history, women weren't encouraged to share those kinds of experiences. So a lot of what happened to Catherine at that time has actually been lost. And I hunted around and found several different articles written by people about Catherine, but again, very scant information existed on her. So really, to bring Catherine to life in my book, I did have to use quite a lot of imagination to fill in a lot of those gaps that exist around her life. I understand there is a biography of Catherine being written by Justine Picardy, the ex-Harper's Bazaar editor from the UK, and I think that's coming out sometime next year. So I'm really looking forward to being able to get some more concrete information about Catherine then. But in the meantime, I have brought Catherine into the story of the Paris secret and used her as one of the characters in the book, used all of the existing information I could find about her and had to embellish that with my own imagination, because the intent was to bring to people's notice and to people's attention this other, arguably more important Dior sibling. So that's a bit of an introduction to one aspect of the book. In terms of what else the book is about, it's about quite a few other things as well. So the book begins with a young woman called Kat, who stumbles upon a collection of Dior gowns hiding in the wardrobes of her grandmother's abandoned cottage in Cornwall. And there are 65 Dior gowns in total, one gown for every year, dating back to Dior's very first collection in February 1947, right through to the present day. And Kat has no idea how her grandmother, who lives in Australia, could possibly have this amazing collection of Dior couture gowns and why they're hiding in a cottage in Cornwall. She tries to ask her grandmother about it, but her grandmother is reticent to give her any answers. And so Kat embarks on a quest to find out more. And it's a quest that takes her right back to Dior's very first showing in Paris in February 1947. And from there, she finds a connection between her grandmother and Catherine Dior, Christian's sister, which astonishes Kat because she never knew there was this connection between her grandmother and the Dior family. She then also finds there's a connection between her grandmother and a group of amazing female pilots who flew the RAF's planes during the Second World War. And once again, she's very surprised to uncover this connection as well. So the more Kat digs, the more Kat begins to realise that she doesn't know her beloved grandmother at all. And she has to decide whether it's worth continuing to find answers or whether she should just leave the past well enough alone. So that is a bit of a précis of the book, I suppose. And so there's quite a lot of different elements that I've mentioned there, and I'm going to talk to you about some of those other elements as we go through today. So when I began with the book, I knew I wanted to write about Catherine Dior and I wanted to incorporate her into the book. And I knew I also wanted to write about a woman stumbling upon and finding an amazing collection of gowns, because that's like a bit of a fantasy of mine. I'd love for that to happen to me one day. And one of the fun things about writing fiction is that you can explore all of those dreams in your books. But I didn't quite know how I was going to bring those things together until I went to the National Gallery of Victoria and I went to that Dior exhibition that I mentioned earlier. And what I found there was really quite surprising, because I think that for most people, if I was to ask you to guess which city outside Paris was the first to show Christian Dior's gowns, most people might guess somewhere like New York or London, one of the fashion capitals of the world. But actually, Sydney in Australia, in my home country, was the first place outside Paris to show Christian Dior's gowns, which I found quite surprising. So what I have here in this picture is the front cover. I took this photograph at the exhibition. It's the front cover of a program of fashion parades called Paris Fashions for All. And the Paris Fashions for All parades were held in a department store in Sydney called David Jones in 1947. And it was a parade dedicated to French fashion. And so there were a number of different designers exhibiting their gowns in these parades, French designers Balenciaga, Balmain, Maggie Ruth, and there were also 4 Christian Dior pieces in those parades. And these parades were something of a spectacle. So this was 1947. It's immediately following the war. Wartime fashion had been very sort of square and boxy, and because of rationing, there wasn't much fabric being used in those clothes. The colours, it's a very bland palette of colours. People had become used to this kind of very sober way of dressing. And back then also, to kind of contextualize, in 1947, there was no such thing as fast fashion. When something was shown in Paris in one of the salons of one of the couturiers, it took about a year for those designs to be filtered out around the world, especially to somewhere like Australia, which was so far away, literally on the other side of the world. And so up until 1947, Australia had been very used to being behind the rest of the world. But suddenly, with these parades taking place, where fashions were coming directly from the salons of the Paris couturiers to this department store in Sydney, Australia was suddenly, up to the moment of fashion. So the department store transformed the entire 4th floor into a French couturier's salon. So there wasn't a raised kind of catwalk, because that wasn't how fashion shows were done back then. Essentially, you had people sitting around in chairs and the models would walk through as if it were a Parisian salon. And the models were flown over from Paris, and they were like the movie star celebrities of today. They were photographed stepping off the aeroplanes. The boxes of the Dior gowns being unloaded from the planes were photographed. There were movie reels all around the country showing the parade rehearsals. And it was this, 2 weeks of Paris fashion that the whole country kind of threw themselves behind. And then the gowns paraded through the salon, and these 4 Dior pieces in particular caused people's mouths to drop open, because they were quite simply astonishing. The amount of fabric that had been used in the gowns, the excess, the shape of the new look that people had perhaps seen photographs of in magazines, but here it was in front of them for the very first time. And so when I found out about that in this museum exhibition, I knew immediately that I wanted to write about that parade that took place in Sydney, and those very first 4 Dior pieces that were shown outside of Paris to this adoring crowd of people in Sydney, Australia. And so Kat, who I mentioned earlier, whose story we're kind of reading about, her and her grandmother, who is a fashion conservator, comes by those first 4 Dior gowns that were shown in Sydney, and they form a part of the story. So I was able to take what I had seen in that exhibition in Melbourne and weave it into the story that way, and thus connect up my Dior thread and Kat finding this wardrobe of gowns through these early Dior pieces from 1947 that were shown to consumers in Australia. So that's one element of the story. When I was summarising the book, I also mentioned that there was a group of pilots in the book, female pilots who flew the RAF's planes during the war. Because generally I like to throw everything I possibly can into a book. I'm never content for it to be a simple story about one thing. I like to pull ideas from very opposite and different places and try to find a way to make them all connect, which is somewhat challenging, but it's always fun to challenge yourself as a writer. So when I was researching my book from last year, The Paris Orphan, I came across the mention of an organisation, a wartime organisation called the Air Transport Auxiliary. And the Air Transport Auxiliary was an organisation set up in the UK where the people working for the organisation would ferry the RAF's planes from factories and maintenance units to the RAF air bases, because there was a massive shortage of male pilots to fly the fighter and bomber planes. So they didn't want to kind of waste manpower on ferrying the planes around from the factories and kind of making those plane deliveries, I guess you could say. So they set up the Air Transport Auxiliary to do that. And they employed a very small group of female pilots. And I was quite fascinated by this idea, because in the 1940s, it was very uncommon for a lot of women to even drive. A lot of women hadn't learned how to drive an automobile, but yet here was this group of women flying aeroplanes during wartime, in relatively dangerous circumstances. So I did a bit of research and a bit of digging, and you can see here, this is a photograph that I took at a museum in England, which is dedicated to the women of the Air Transport Auxiliary. You can see a group of the women gathered around one of their aeroplanes in that photograph there. So initially there were only 8 women employed by the Air Transport Auxiliary, and they weren't welcomed with open arms might be something of an understatement, because they're flying planes for the RAF. The RAF was a very male-dominated organisation. Only men could be a part of the RAF, and it certainly, to say it, it was a very patriarchal organisation, again, would be something of an understatement. So when word got out that 8 women were being allowed to fly the RAF's planes, there was a flurry of letters to the editors of various newspapers around England from men, claiming things like it was disgusting that women were going to be allowed to fly the RAF's planes, particularly because women didn't even have the intelligence to scrub the floor properly. So how could they possibly have the intelligence to fly an aeroplane? And that's a verbatim quote. I'm not making that up. You can't make this stuff up because you wouldn't imagine that anyone could ever say that. And so who are these women who actually, most of them had around 2,000 hours of flying experience. So at that time, because the RAF was so desperate for male pilots, they were allowing male pilots to join with only 20 hours of flying experience. Yet these women had 2,000 hours of flying experience, and people were writing letters saying that they weren't even smart enough to scrub their floors properly. And so they were dismissing all of this experience that these women had. So it was a pretty challenging start for those women. But as well as this kind of public outcry against the idea of women flying aeroplanes, there was the actual circumstances in which they had to fly those planes that were also incredibly challenging. So because they were collecting the aeroplanes from factories, the aeroplanes weren't kind of finished off. And so they were lacking things like navigation aids. They had no navigation aids for the pilots whatsoever. And so the female pilots were told that the way to fly the planes to work out how to get from point A to point B was to follow the railroads and the old Roman roads in England. So they needed to be in sight of the ground at all times so they could basically see where they were going, which meant not ever being stuck in cloud, because of course if you get stuck in cloud you can't see the ground. They had no radio in their aeroplanes to call in to find out where they were if they were lost, or to get updated weather forecasts. They were literally flying blind if they ever did get stuck in cloud. But of course we're talking about England, and we all know English weather is, you know, a little on the cloudy side and not entirely predictable. So it was very common for these women to set out on what appeared to be a fine day and then to suddenly mid-flight be stuck in the thick of cloud that they couldn't see out of. They didn't know how long it would last for, whether they could just fly out of it and into clear skies, or whether they would literally be stuck in cloud for hours, flying until they ran out of fuel and crashed into the North Sea, which many did. They were also shot at by the Luftwaffe in their planes, and of course they had no guns or any way of defending themselves. They flew into hills because they were stuck in cloud and couldn't see where they were going. So it was this incredibly dangerous job that many women lost their lives for. And as if that wasn't bad enough, as well as these letters kind of being written to the editor to try and, you know, embarrass the women into stepping down from their roles and, you know, having to suffer these incredibly dangerous flying conditions, the RAF also decided to really test the mettle of the women to, I think essentially to try to make them, to try to make them stand down and to try to make them leave the Air Transport Auxiliary. This was at the very start in 1940. The women were only initially allowed to fly the kind of RAF's trainer aeroplanes. They eventually were able to fly all of the aeroplanes, the big 4-engine bombers, the Spitfires, everything. But early on, they were only allowed to fly kind of Tiger Moths. And so these are open cockpit aeroplanes. An open cockpit aeroplane means literally that there's no cockpit around you. You're out exposed to all of the elements. And so they were kind enough to provide the women with, you know, flying overalls and a sheepskin jacket and a pair of boots. But then they said to them, over the winter of 1939, 1940, 1941, they asked them to fly these open cockpit aeroplanes with just their flight overalls and their jacket to Scotland. So it was like a 3-hour flight in minus 30 degrees wind chill, exposed to all of the elements. And only the women were asked to take these flights in these open cockpit aeroplanes to Scotland. The men were allowed to fly the planes further south where it was warmer, and the planes that had closed cockpits. And so these women would arrive in Scotland literally so cold that they couldn't move. They couldn't even stand up to get out of the plane. They had to be bodily lifted out of the aeroplanes by the engineers, which of course the RAF tried to use as evidence that the women were incapable of doing their jobs, despite the fact that it's unlikely that anyone, not even a man, would be able to move their body after such a freezing and challenging flight. So it was a very, very challenging time for those women, but none of them backed down. They withstood 2,000 of those freezing flights to Scotland over that first winter. And then after that, things began to change as the women proved that they could fly aeroplanes, in fact, more safely than the men, and that they were more than capable and certainly had the intelligence to be able to fly those aeroplanes. So these women of the Air Transport Auxiliary, here's another photograph. I went over to a number of military museums over in England to research them, because for me, reading about the mechanics of flying in a book would have kind of bored me to tears and wouldn't have enabled me to bring these pilots to life in the way I wanted to in the book. So for me, it was all about finding pictures of them and reading those anecdotes about them and reading those letters to the editor that enabled me to bring them to life. Because what I love to do in my books is, find forgotten women from history who were incredibly brave and who do deserve to be remembered. And certainly the female pilots of the Air Transport Auxiliary fitted all of those things. And I was really happy to be able to bring them to life through the main character of Skye, who is connected in some way to Kat's grandmother in The Paris Secret. So one of the last things I wanted to talk about today are some of those dresses in The Paris Secret, in that kind of wardrobe of 65 gowns that I mentioned earlier. So the book begins, there's a prologue that takes place in Christian Dior's salon in 1947 at his very first parade. And we see Margot, Kat's grandmother, wearing the bar suit as she parades through the salon. And so, of course, if I'm going to write about the bar suit, a very iconic Dior gown, plus 65 gowns in a wardrobe, I needed to be able to see them all. In his autobiography, Christian Dior says that the most important thing about a dress is that it should be expressive. And for me, the best way to find out exactly what a dress is expressing is to go and see it for myself. So I decided to travel the world and visit various fashion museums in my quest to find the perfect 65 gowns to include in this mystery wardrobe in The Paris Secret. And so one of the places, I've mentioned a couple of the different museums I went to, also went to the Met Museum in New York, and here are two beautiful Dior gowns that I saw at the Met Museum. This is Dior's Junon gown, one of my personal favorites, and Dior's Venus gown, which is also another extremely stunning and beautiful gown. So as you can imagine, researching isn't so hard when you get to look at beautiful things like this on your research travels. Some other ones that I found that I particularly loved and had to include in the book are this more contemporary piece from 2010. Kat wears this dress out on a date because, it's definitely a first date dress, isn't it? Here's the bar suit that I mentioned earlier. This is a very iconic piece that many of you have probably seen photographs of, and that one appears in the first scene in The Paris Secret. And I also wanted to have some dresses that were pretty fun in there too. So this little pink one here with this gorgeous flower-like bustle on the back of it is called the Opera Bouffe. It's from 1956, and that's a fun, fabulous pink gown that you'll also find in the book. And Dior did love a bit of red, so there are a couple of red dresses in the book. This one's Aladdin, this one's from 1947, and Kat wears this one in the book too. It's a beautiful gown. Even though it's from 1947, you could easily wear that today, and it wouldn't look a little bit out of date. And white, another popular Dior colour. This one's called Le Muguet, or Lily of the Valley, and you can see it's decorated with hundreds of tiny little white Lily of the Valley flowers, very intricately designed. So those are just some of the dresses that are in The Paris Secret. And if you are reading the book and want to see pictures of those, on my website I have in my kind of blog section an article with pictures of some of those gowns. I know some readers like to be able to reference the pictures when they're reading the book, so you can do that. And the very last thing I wanted to touch on was another part of my research that was especially fun and a very unexpected little surprise. So the book is, The Paris Secret is a dual narrative. It has the historical storyline to do with those female pilots and Catherine Dior, etc. And it has the contemporary storyline where Kat is kind of researching her grandmother's past. And Kat is a fashion conservator. And I think this would be my dream job. If I wasn't a writer, I would be a fashion conservator, although I need a science degree to be able to do it. So I'd have to go back to university again. But I wanted to find out more about what a fashion conservator did. And I also wanted to not just see Dior's gowns from the outside, I wanted to see the inside of them, because I'd heard that the way his gowns were constructed was something quite remarkable. So I sent an email off to a museum in Sydney, Australia, called the Powerhouse Museum, because I knew they had quite an extensive collection of fashion and they had fashion conservators working at the museum. And I just explained who I was and you know, that I was interested in learning more about fashion conservation and looking at Dior gowns also. And so I just sent the email to the regular information email address on the homepage of the website. I didn't know a name or anything like that. And I just crossed my fingers that the email would find its way to the right person. And I was very lucky because whoever did receive that email passed it on to one of the fashion conservators at the museum. And at the exact same moment, she happened to be reading The Paris Seamstress, which is my book from a couple of years ago. And so because she was reading my book at the time she received my email, she knew exactly who I was and was more than happy to help me. It was one of those amazing serendipitous moments that happen sometimes when you're researching and writing that you can't quite believe and that you live for, I suppose. So she invited me to come across to the museum and spend a day shadowing her basically and watching her do her job and to learn all the elements of what a fashion conservator would do on any given day. So that was lots of fun. But then she also took me down into the archives of the museum where they store all of the museum's objects and all of their fashion objects. And so she had me put on this pair of blue rubber gloves. And then she led me over to this kind of set of drawers, large stacked kind of drawers. And she pulled out one of these very long drawers, and nestled inside was this Dior gown that you might be able to see here. You can probably see the label. I'll put it upside down. Christian Dior, just there. And we saw about 3 pieces like this. This is a white piece, which I've got out because it's a little easier to see the inside of it than the black piece, which is harder to photograph. But one of the things you might be able to see is all of these amazing little hook and eye closures that are sewn into the dress here. Essentially, Dior made his dresses so that you didn't require any corsetry or underwear of any kind because it was all built into the dress. So everything you needed to be able to make the dress achieve the shape that it was supposed to achieve was all sewn into the dress. And honestly, the inside of these dresses is like a work of art in and of itself. It's quite astonishing and quite amazing. And so to be able to, you can see my blue rubber gloved hands resting on the edge of the drawer there, looking at this amazing Dior creation all wrapped in tissue paper. So to be able to touch the interior of a couple of Dior pieces from the 1940s and see all of the workings in there. Other things they did was they had little lead weights covered in soft fabric inside the gown so that they would hang correctly, again, so that everything that the dress needed to achieve the shape it was supposed to achieve was all built in there. So it's probably one of the best research experiences of my life for someone who loves fashion history as much as I do, to be able to do that. So it was a joy to write The Paris Secret. It combined so many of my passions, you know, women from history doing amazing things, fashion, and a whole lot of other elements. So I hope that if you have the chance to read the book, that you enjoy it too. And I think, I mean, I could talk for hours more, but I won't because I've just realized that I've kind of reached my 40 minutes. So I'll stop speaking for a minute and just hand it back over to Joan and see if there are any questions from anyone that I'm happy to answer.
Okay, that was wonderful. Thank you for sharing all the pictures. They're fascinating. I don't have any questions yet in the chat, but I do have some questions of my own. I'm impressed at when you read the book, at the end, there are quite a few pages with the author's note, and you gave a history of some of the books that you had read. And I think that for all of us who love historical fiction, that's my favorite genre. You know, it's easy to get captivated in the story, but when you start to break it down, I can't imagine that you could write a book like this. How long does it take you to write a book?
That's a very good question. It's probably about 2.5 years all up. I tend to, when I very first have an idea, let it sit for about 6 months in the back of my mind, and I'll just be scribbling down notes about that idea to try to make it grow, just try to see if it will grow into something that can be sustained over the course of a book. I don't tend to plan up front when I write. I've tried, and I'm a very organized person in all other aspects of my life, but when it comes to kind of planning a story, I find that very challenging to do up front. So for me, I have to actually kind of start writing and see where the story unfolds. So that means I need a little bit of time, especially when I'm trying to incorporate, you know, pilots and Catherine Dior and a wardrobe of dresses, you know, kind of disparate ideas. I like to try to kind of gestate on those for a bit of time, I suppose, before I sit down and then start writing. And then I'll write for a solid year and research over that time as well. So I tend to, write a first draft over a couple of months quite quickly to work out what the story is, then spend a whole month just on research. So traveling usually, apart from in a COVID year, and also, reading everything I can get my hands on, accessing museum archives online if I can't travel, but traveling as much as I possibly can. And then I'll spend the rest of the year kind of rewriting and rewriting. And then it spends about not quite a year at the publisher, just going through various editing processes as well. So it's about 2.5 years all up. So you really have to love what you're writing about to be able to, stay the course for 2.5 years. And, I'm always picking ideas that I do love and that are going to sustain my interest for that time.
Well, and I noticed that you do a lot of research. Like when you wrote this story, it was basically you wanted to get the facts out about Catherine Dior, but you had mentioned that you had read the book, The Parisiennes. Were you just reading that for your enjoyment, or did you say, that to me was amazing that you read about this? It's about the women, how the women of Paris lived, loved, and died in the 1940s. So did you already know about Catherine, or were you just reading this historical book and you thought, oh, I'll write about Catherine Dior?
I was pretty much just reading that for fun. I know it sounds like a crazy book to read for fun, but it brought together all the things that I love. I mean, I love France. I speak the language fluently, and it was about women's lives, which I'm quite fascinated with in history. And so her book has been quite remarkable because I've actually got a couple, the book that's coming out next year is based on a woman who I also read about in that book too. So that book has proved very fertile ground for my imaginings and for my stories, because she literally does, pull out of the historical record so many women who nobody's heard of, but who did some quite astonishing things. And it's a really interesting book because she looks at not just the women who resisted and worked against the Nazis, but also the women who collaborated, because there was a lot of collaboration that went on during wartime. So it's a really interesting kind of comparison of why someone might choose to collaborate rather than condemning women for that. She really digs into their reasoning for that, or why someone might choose to resist. And so I was just lucky that it happened to be a book that, hit all my hot buttons as far as areas of interest go. Because if I hadn't have read that, who knows what I would be writing about at the moment. So thank you, Anne Seba. She probably doesn't have any idea that this author has, found such inspiration in her book.
Well, and like you said, your books are dual narratives. So you find this idea from Anne Seba's book, and then there are so many other books that you recognize. One is it's the biography of, is it Charlotte de Gaulle? That she was
Geraldine de Gaulle, yes. Genevieve de Gaulle, sorry.
Right, and she was in Ravensbrück as well. And I'm amazed that you think of accessing all these books in order to get your facts down. So I think that's important for our audience to know, is not only do you have this idea of, oh, I love fashion and I just want people to know about fashion. You have unbelievable records of what you have researched, and it amazes me that you can write a book so quickly. How many hours a day do you spend writing?
I have 3 school-age children. In fact, my youngest is still in primary school. So I really only write during those kind of school hours, because I have to be around when the kids come home to help with homework and all of those sorts of things. So really I'm usually at my desk about 9 o'clock, and I work till about 3 o'clock most days, which, is enough to get everything done. But yes, you mentioned the memoir, Genevieve de Gaulle's memoir there, and memoirs are such a rich source of information for me. And that's one of the wonderful things about that time in history. there wasn't the internet, so records weren't transient. People did sit down and transcribe their memoirs and record their memories of their experiences. And so I spend a lot of time looking around on secondhand book websites, trying to find copies of those memoirs that were published, you know, decades ago, like Genevieve de Gaulle's memoirs. And I found several memoirs written by the Women of the Air Transport Auxiliary too, which I purchased and read. So, or going to libraries, because often you can find those kinds of things at libraries. So yes, you know, there's nothing better than reading the recollections of someone who lived the life that you are trying to write about, because the kinds of details that they include in their memoirs are the kinds of details that make the fiction sound authentic. And so I love to, you know, immerse myself in someone's story of their time and their place in history.
It's fascinating. Well, now we do have a few questions in our chat. There's a question about the cover art of the book. What role, if any, did you have in your cover art?
So essentially the way covers work is that the publisher will have their preferred kind of cover designers, and they will send a brief to that cover designer, and then they will come back with cover concepts, and you'll have a conversation with the publisher about the different elements of the covers. I'm very lucky in that I have amazing teams here in Australia and in the UK and in the US, all working on, we have different covers for all of those markets, and they have amazing design teams who are working on quite beautiful covers. Particularly here in Australia, I have a lot of input with my publisher. You know, we tend to start talking about covers about a year before the book comes out, and we start sending each other photographs and images that represent the kind of mood we feel like we're trying to evoke. And so that dialogue goes for quite a long time. The most challenging part of any book cover in historical fiction is finding a figure for the front cover who looks authentically from the era, who doesn't look like a contemporary woman playing dress-ups, which a lot of the photographs are, because sometimes if it's a very old photograph, it won't reproduce well enough on the front cover of the book to be striking enough. So the most amount of time we would spend is finding those kinds of elements, that getting the female figure right. That can be very hard work.
That's great. Now, do you have any, what if you say, well, I like the UK's cover better than the Australian cover? Will they listen to you?
Well, I think for me, it's the publishers know their own market. And one of the things I've learned over the last couple of years is that every market has such a different aesthetic. You know, the covers that we have here in Australia are very different to the UK, very different to the US. So it seems that there are certain cues that work well in different markets, and readers in different markets are used to seeing certain things on covers. So I tend to defer to the expertise of my publishers in those other markets that I have very little experience with. You know, obviously living in Australia, I know the market here really well and feel like I have more expertise to offer, but I don't feel like I have much expertise to offer my publishers overseas at all, because I don't, you know, I might see their markets once a year when I'm there for a research trip, but that's about all. In fact, I've not actually managed to get to the US since I've had a book out there. So I've never actually seen my book in a shop in America yet. And that is very high on my bucket list. It was meant to happen this year. So I would love one day to be able to walk into a Barnes & Noble or somewhere in the US and see my book in a bookshop. That would be quite a wonderful experience over there.
We have a display at the White Rabbit. I just talked to the owner the other day, and she has the Paris Orphan, the Paris Seamstress, and the Paris Secret all lined up in front. So I'll make sure we get a picture and we'll send that to you.
Oh, thank you.
You can at least have the photograph.
Yep.
I have another question. I'm talking too much and I'm not asking these questions. I'd also love to know what other historical fiction books you'd recommend and what you're working on right now.
Sure. So I'm working on at the moment 2 books. One is virtually finished. This is the one that's coming out next year. So in September next year, there'll be another historical novel called The Riviera House coming out. And as the title might suggest, that partly is set on the French Riviera, a little town called Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat down in the south of France, which is a beautiful town, and it was very hard to have to go there to do my research and spend a week there. But that also draws on the story of another quite remarkable woman from history, and sort of tells her story about what she did during the war in France. So it's I think basically all of that book is set in France. So if you like a good French historical novel, war story, dual narrative again, then look out for the Riviera House next year. But I'm also working on writing the book for the year after as well. So I'm tending to be editing one and writing another. And so that's coming together well, but there's still quite a lot of work to do on that one. So I can't really talk too much about that one, other than to say it's called To Lily from Paris, I think at the moment, that's the working title. But in terms of books that I would recommend about historical fiction, I'm just turning around and looking at my bookshelves behind me. So I've got a number of favorites. One of my probably favourite kind of wartime historical novels is by Kate Atkinson, an English writer, and it's called A God in Ruins. It's got the most devastating conclusion to a book. I think I took about a fortnight to recover from that book. So that's one I can recommend. I love Ian McEwan's Atonement as well. I think that's, again, got that ending where you literally feel like the ground has been pulled out from underneath you. So that's another one. And I mean, Kristen Hanna's The Nightingale, everyone loves that book, and probably most people have read that. Kate Quinn is another one of my favourite historical novelists, and both her books, The Alice Network and The Huntress, are books that I would recommend for anyone interested in historical fiction, strong women, and stories from that time.
Okay, let's see. I really liked The Paris Seamstress and The Paris Orphan, and have The Paris Secret in my TBR pile, to be read pile. Will your next novel also have a Paris connection? And basically you answered that with the Riviera. The next question was, does the publisher finance the travel for research, or do you have to personally front that?
So because it's part of your writing process, I do organise all of that and do all of that myself, because I have to work out where I need to go and what I'm doing. And certainly there's no requirement for me to go and travel for research. It's how I prefer to work, because I feel as if it better equips me to be able to write about the era, the places and the characters authentically. I think maybe it's different if you're writing historical fiction that doesn't have so much of a basis in facts and isn't so embedded in real people and real events. But because many of the characters in The Paris Secret are real people, so all of the female pilots that I talk about here, apart from the main character Sky, they're all real people. The Diors are obviously real people. And particularly when you are writing a little bit about something sensitive like Ravensbrück concentration camp, I think it's really important that you do get down on the ground and do the actual location-based research. So no, that's something that an author will choose to do or not themselves, and will, finance themselves. And generally, my husband and my 3 kids, they always come with me, and so we turn it into a bit of a family holiday. And it means my kids have explored some parts of the world that, most people go to France and go and see the Eiffel Tower. We go to France and we go and see some really crazy things that are part of my research, which they love because it means they have all of these wonderful experiences that they wouldn't have otherwise had. So I call them my 3 trusty research assistants, and they love coming along to help me do my book research.
I think we'd all like to be your 3 trusty research assistants at this point. Okay, we have a couple more. You write about great, strong females. Is this a conscious choice or just what you identify with?
I think initially it was probably a bit of an accident in my very first historical novel, which actually isn't available in the US, which is about a young woman trying to become one of the first female obstetricians in New York City in the 1920s. And I stumbled upon that idea by pure accident, and it seemed like quite a fascinating thing to write about. And the more I wrote about it, the more I started to think about how much I was enjoying researching and writing that story. And that was something I wanted to continue to do. So when I wrote that first historical novel, I didn't really know whether anyone would publish it. I had written 2 books previously that were contemporary fiction, more literary kind of fiction. And so this was a big departure and a big shift for me. So really that first book was just all about getting this story out that I desperately wanted to write. And so only from then on was I able to more consciously kind of, once I knew someone was going to publish that and I could kind of unfold a career in historical fiction writing, then I started to think more seriously about that. And I mean, really for me, the ideas that I choose to write about are things I stumble upon by accident. They're always things that I find when I'm researching another book. So for example, when I was researching The Paris Orphan, I came across Catherine Dior when I was doing that research. And so immediately I went, oh my gosh, I have to write about her. And then when I was researching The Paris Secret, I found the woman I'm writing about in the Riviera house. And, you know, they're usually 1 or 2 line, maybe a paragraph mention in a book that I'm reading. And most other people would just read that paragraph like any other paragraph in the book, but something about the way that woman is written about in that paragraph just sparks off that light in the back of my mind that makes me think, I want to find out more about her. And then I start doing a bit of digging, and luckily, always I have become more fascinated in that character. I'm really a one idea at a time writer. Other writers say they have, you know, 20 ideas parked in their desk drawer. That's not me. So I love it when I have those moments of sparking and inspiration, because it's like, oh, thank goodness, now I know what I'm going to write about for my next book. It's quite good to find that.
That's great. Okay, let's see. The next one. I'd like to know, when you write dual timeline books, do you write one period in time first and then the other, or jump around?
That's a very good question. I write one whole narrative, and it's always the historical narrative that I write first, and then I'll write the contemporary narrative, and then I will work out how to weave those 2 things together. I think for me, because as I mentioned before, I can't seem to plan my stories out up front. I have to write them to work out what the story is. If I was to try to cut back and forth between 2 sets of characters and 2 different time periods, I think I would literally lose my mind. So I have to really stay embedded in that historical narrative to let myself unfold that story and see how that might progress, and then write the contemporary storyline, and then start to see how those things might fit together and make adjustments to each storyline based on how the other one has evolved. So that means a lot of sort of moving around and chopping up the book and working out what is the best way to fit these 2 things together. So there's quite a lot of time spent in that, because I do write them separately. But for me, I find that the best way to fully immerse myself in the historical world, and then to fully immerse myself in the contemporary world. It works well for my writing brain.
Well, and then you can keep all your research straight too, because I imagine with all, like I said, with all the books that you note in your author's note, it's amazing the amount of facts that you have to back it up.
Yes, managing the research is quite a challenging thing sometimes. It's probably sometimes more challenging than the writing.
Right. Okay, let's see. What do you think about the audiobook productions of your work?
That's also a good question. So we do spend quite a lot of time choosing the narrators for the audiobooks. And again, once again, that can be quite challenging because of the number of different accents that are often involved. So for example, in The Paris Secret, the narrator has to be able to do English accents, American accents, French accents. So we have to find someone who's very versatile. It's not the same as just choosing someone who is just doing one accent straight for the whole book. And we tend to choose a couple of different narrators to do the different narrative time threads. So for example, you'll find 4 narrators in The Paris Orphan and 2 narrators in The Paris Secret. So there's a lot of back and forth of auditions from narrators, a lot of no, they're not right. You know immediately when you listen to an audition if someone isn't right. And we found year after year that the Australian accent is the hardest one for people to be able to do. So we tend to, if the contemporary character is Australian, get an Australian narrator to narrate that, because we found that for some reason it's impossible to replicate. I'm not sure why. And I have heard actors say it's the hardest accent to reproduce as well. So it's a really interesting and quite fun process. We spend, a good month on, finding those narrators and, making sure we make the right choice. And in your head as a writer how a character should sound. And so you've got to wait till you find the narrator who sounds like that.
Well, that's nice that you can be involved in that final decision, that they let you.
Yes.
That's nice. All right, this is the last question. What do you think about the audiobook productions of your work? Oh, that's actually the same. Let's see. That's pretty much the same question. Were you involved in the selection, and what do you think of the audio production? So that's it. Well, I have really enjoyed this discussion with you. This is great. And like I said, I think the most impressive thing for me is the amount of research that you have done, like how you have, I think you've traveled over 12,000 miles to visit all of these places. I don't know how you get these books read. It's so impressive. So I will definitely be reading your next book. We will be sure to get that. And hopefully you can join us for another discussion. Maybe not virtually, but maybe by some off chance you'll find yourself in Southern Maryland. So anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate you spending your time with us, and we all really enjoyed this program. Thank you, Natasha.
Oh, it was my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much to everyone who made the time this evening to come along and watch. I really appreciate that, and I really appreciate your support too. Thank you, Joan.
Thank you, and you take care. And like I said, anybody that would like a copy of the book, we have it at the library, of course, and we also have the owner of the White Rabbit bookstore. She's got a full display, and like I said, I'll take a picture of that and make sure you get it so you know how it's set up. So thank you very much, and you have a nice day. Thanks.
Will do. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Take care. Bye-bye.